My name is Virginia Hausiger and I am delighted to be your MC here today and tomorrow throughout this conference. So leadership, why are you here? Silence. What makes a leader? What makes a good leader? Can we learn leadership? Can leadership be reluctant? Is it normal for leaders to sometimes want to step down and step back, put their feet up and let someone else take charge? Should we all aspire to leadership? And if we do, who's going to follow? Who'll be left? What are the unique cultural challenges of leadership in Australia? Australia, as we know, is the land of the tall poppy, the tall poppy syndrome, where we don't like it when someone's star shines a little bit too brightly, particularly if they're actively out there doing the hard yards and drawing attention to themselves. Australians are fiercely egalitarian, and that means at times we have a somewhat ambivalent relationship to leadership. We have one of the best and strongest democracies in the world, and yet our own research at the University of Canberra at IGPA, the Institute for Governance and Policy Analysis, has found that Australians have a very low level of trust in our political leaders, and indeed in our political system. But what that same research has found is that despite the prevailing stereotype that suggests young Australians, Gen Y, are an apathetic bunch, we have found that that's simply not true. And to quote Professor Mark Evans, who's the director of IGPA, young Australian citizens are a sail and not an anchor for the ship of Australian democracy. That research provides good grounds for optimism and shows that young Australians have the enthusiasm and capacity to change the direction of Australian politics. And we're hoping the enthusiasm and capacity to expand the talent pool of Australian leadership. Now, one of our greatest concerns in Australia is why is it that there's such a dearth of women in key leadership positions? We can all point to examples of women in leadership positions in Australia. Yes, we've had a female Prime Minister. Yes, we've had a female Governor-General. But, of course, they're both gone. And yes, at one stage, there were 3 women sitting at the COAG table. Now it's down to 1. We've never got even close in Australia to that critical mass of 30% of women in key leadership positions. That was a target set by the Commonwealth many years ago and a target to be achieved in 2015. We are nowhere near it. So, over the next couple of days, as we prod and poke and ask ourselves many questions about leadership in Australia, one of those questions must be why there is such a gender gap in Australian leadership. There are many questions that we hope you're going to be inspired to ask over the next couple of days. And if not inspiration, maybe rage might provoke you. At a high-level leaders' roundtable held at the University of Canberra on Tuesday, one of Australia's most successful women entrepreneurs suddenly asked around the table, can a leader be angry? And I don't think there was one leader sitting at that table who didn't hesitate when they said, yes. Leadership can at times mean many different things. At times it can be decidedly uncomfortable. And it can sometimes mean taking a stand and making yourself very unpopular. Sometimes leadership can guarantee that many people won't like you. One thing that great leaders all have in common is a moral compass. And in Australia, we have witnessed and been privileged to witness some fine and indeed honourable examples of political leadership that is both visionary and driven by a clear moral compass. And it's to such people that we now turn to take our cues about true leadership. You're going to be meeting a number of esteemed leaders from around Australia over the next 2 days. But right now, it gives me great pleasure to sit down and make way for one of Australia's most outstanding leaders and from whom we have much to learn. And before I do move on to introduce that first session, I just want to add, We will be taking questions from the audience at the end of this session, so please save your questions for the end. Media questions will be postponed. If you have questions from the media for our guest speaker, I'm going to stop those and ask that you take those during the tea break. The first question session is just for participants. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you the moderator for this first session. I'm delighted to introduce my Canberra University colleague and professorial fellow, Michelle Grattan, the Chief Political Correspondent of The Conversation. Michelle.
Thanks very much, Virginia, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today, and I hope the conference is very informative and very stimulating for you. Before I introduce John Howard, I just want to make a few general remarks about leadership and draw out some strands from his leadership which he might elaborate on, and you might find some material for questions in. Successful leaders, whether in politics, business, the community sector or the military, share many common qualities and skills. They have to be decisive, possess a solid system of values and beliefs, be able to generate ideas or strategies, know their game, have the knack of producing a collegiate team, and have the ability to communicate effectively. These broad requirements will play out differently, however, depending on the sphere in which they're operating and their particular circumstances. Obviously, under these broad common qualities and skills, there are different imperatives for the general who commands an army, a military operation, for the business person who builds an enterprise, for the political leader who runs a government or an opposition. And measures of their success will correspondingly be quite different. A victory in war, a substantial return to the shareholders, a string of election wins. In this session, we are focusing, of course, particularly on political leadership, which has, especially in the modern world, become a highly testing requirements and special constraints. The Prime Ministership is generally considered the hardest job in the country, although some would say that it's even harder to be an opposition leader. Tenure is precarious. A Prime Minister faces potentially harsh judgments, not just by the electorate, but even by his or her colleagues. When he headed off a spill motion recently, Tony Abbott admitted he'd been through a humbling experience. A Prime Minister operates in a complex, demanding policy environment, and important parts of it, such as international developments, are beyond his or her influence. And sometimes they have to manage fractious colleagues, whether they're senior ministers with an eye to the top job or backbenchers who are terrified that they might lose their seats at the next election. Deciding what's thought to be right has to be balanced with considerations of what's possible politically, what's saleable to the voters. And in these days of the 24-hour news cycle, constant polling and the continuous election campaign atmosphere, leaders find themselves buffeted about by the winds of constant and instant judgments by the voting public in the form of polls, and worn down by the presence of constant exposure to the news cycles and the public opinions reflected through those news cycles. One really interesting question, I think, is whether, as author Paul Kelly has argued, modern Australia has become nearly ungovernable as a result of the media and other pressures on leaders, or whether good leadership can in fact break through those constraints, those difficulties, those pressures. Now, in introducing John Howard, I'm not going to rehearse his biography, you all know that, but I do want to just draw out several key features of his leadership which I think are very relevant to our discussion today. And that those features cover his period both in opposition and in government, taking his whole period of political leadership as a whole. One quality, I think, which is really important in evaluating John Howard's leadership, and one that I hope he might touch on, is the question of resilience, staying the course, not walking away in the face of rejection by your colleagues in particular. Something that I think is a really important quality of leadership and reflects a leader's determination, and I think the psychology of all that is interesting. And in this resilience, John Howard repeated a pattern that, of course, we saw in Robert Menzies, who was rejected by his colleagues, then formed a new party and, of course, had a record-breaking period as Prime Minister second time round. And we also saw resilience in different circumstances by Kevin Rudd much later. And in each of these cases, the resilience paid off in terms of eventually getting the Prime Ministership, in Menzies' case, regaining the Prime Ministership, in Rudd's case, by, I think, saving quite a few seats for Labor. Another Howard leadership quality was the ability to learn and change, and I think this is a really vital one in a political leader. How one copes with the down periods as well as the up periods and adapts to new circumstances, particularly important for a modern political leader with a long career. The third Howard leadership quality that I just want to mention is a commitment to policy ideas. We all talk about the need for governments to be able to reform and to meet the demands of the modern policy world. But as we know, this is far harder done than said, and as we've seen in quite recent times. And my memory of John Howard over the years was a politician who evolved as a policy thinker from his earlier days in terms of economic policy as dampish, I think he'd admit, to an economic dry, to an opposition leader who in the 1980s had a quite influential effect on the policy debate, even though he was not in government at that time, and who in government, of course, pursued a big idea, a big policy change in terms of reform of the taxation system, and one that took him to the brink of defeat, but not over the brink of defeat, and left a lasting effect on our economic system. And later, of course, pursued, not so successfully, another big policy idea in terms of industrial relations. And that brings me to a final point, that when one's stint as a leader is over, it is important to be able to say there's a legacy from that leadership, not just a period of occupation but in the job, but something that has been left behind, something that's quite solid in terms of policy or whatever. And I think that that is a measure of successful leadership, a vital measure. Now, I want to invite John Howard to come up and share some of the insights from his period of very successful leadership.
Well, thank you very much, Michelle, Virginia, General Peter Lay, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure, can I say at the outset, to have been introduced by Michelle Grattan. I can remember Michelle as a prominent member of the press gallery from almost the first year I arrived here in Canberra, and I've always been impressed with her extraordinary diligence, attention to detail and superb professionalism, and I respect her enormously for the contribution she continues to make to interpreting the politics of the federal capital of Australia. I'd like to share a few reflections about leadership, inevitably based on my own experience. Naturally, political leadership is different. Military leadership is different again, and thinking of what's going to happen this afternoon at the Sydney Cricket Ground, sporting leadership is also different again. And the best one can do, having occupied a position of leadership in the political sphere, is to try and recount what I thought were the principal strands, what I responded to, and the observations that I make about the experience. The most important thing about leadership is to believe in something. I don't think anybody who lacks a set of convictions, no matter what the area of leadership is, can possibly be a successful leader. All political leaders have colourful things said about them, and there were plenty of colourful things said about me. Some of you will judge them accurate, even understatements of the truth. Others would have found them outrageous. I won't go into any of that, but I never minded people saying that they despised everything I stood for, except they did in fact know what I stood for. And I always thought that was a very important plus point, I suppose, of political leadership. Michelle, in her introduction, invited me to say something about resilience. It is true that if you are to succeed in any walk of life, you have to show resilience. I remember talking to Bob Hawke once about leading in opposition, and he said to me, because John, I never had any time for leading in opposition, that's why I was only an opposition leader for 5 weeks. And then he became Prime Minister. Now, there was, of course, a little bit of hyperbole in that, but he was different in that he had come to the office of opposition leader after only a short period of time in Parliament. And then within a few weeks he became Prime Minister of Australia. But, of course, in his earlier career, when he was leader of the ACTU for a long time, he was constantly trying to get into Parliament. And he was often being denied by various factions in the Victorian Labor Party and the like. So even though it's not apparent after his successful political career, he had to persevere and show a certain amount of resilience and commitment. But the best validation I can give of the importance of resilience is to describe my own experience. In 1989, I had been leader of the opposition, not altogether successfully because I'd lost an election, and although I was returned to the leadership after that election in 1987, my colleagues grew impatient and moves were put in train, and I was removed from the leadership in May of 1989, and I was feeling fairly ordinary, to say the least, about that experience. And some people said to me, John, you ought to get out. And people said, look, you're just under 50, you ought to get out, you ought to go and get a job in business or something or other. And I thought about it. I was never really contemplating getting out because it was too completely in my blood. But what really sustained me in public life after that experience, and after we lost the 1990 election and the Liberal Party decided to embrace as its leader John Hewson, who was some 8 or 9 years younger than I, and the idea was you moved on to the next generation. Generations were then defined in 9 or 10 years. People said, well, John, that's the end. You know, we're moving on to the next generation. But what really sustained me, part, of course, the continuing ambition, and you should never deny the importance of ambition in successful leaders. It's a necessary prerequisite to being successful, to be ambitious, to hold the top position. What really sustained me during the next few years was that I found a great deal of satisfaction in focusing on a policy area. And John Hewson invited me to become the spokesman on industrial relations for the opposition. And between 1990 and indeed the early part of 1995, when I returned to the opposition leadership, I was the coalition spokesman on industrial relations, and I had long had the view that we needed to change our industrial relations system. And I found that experience of focusing on that policy area and working through the debate and the advocacy of that change, I found that immensely rewarding, and it probably more than anything else sustained my commitment and interest in politics. And that really goes back to the point I made at the beginning, that you've got to believe in something. I actually thought very strongly that this country needed to change its industrial relations system. I still do, incidentally, because our industrial relations system now has gone back virtually in some respects to what it was in the 1970s and 1980s. So having a strong set of beliefs and remembering that, in the words of Robert Menzies, politics is a battle of ideas, and you must bring to that battle the capacity to persuade. Persuasion is far more important in politics as a skill than anything else, and different people can persuade in different ways. But there's no substitute for having a capacity to persuade people. And my experience is that the Australian public will listen a lot more closely to a properly argued proposition than common regular commentary these days has it. So having a clear set of values and beliefs and making sure that people know what you stand for is hugely important. In fact, I put it above everything else in successful leadership. The next quality that I think is hugely important is the relationship between the leader and the immediately led. Now, the relationship between the leader and the general constituency to which he or she is appealing is important. But what is super important is the relationship between the leader and the immediately led, because it's impossible to transmit your ideas and your theories of leadership and articulate your goals effectively without having the assistance of other people. The most successful field commanders in war are those who have close relations with their staff officers. The most successful political leaders are those who have close relationships and understand and listen to those around them. You cannot, as a Prime Minister, take your cabinet members or your parliamentary party for granted. A Prime Minister in our system is merely a first amongst equals. One of the problems with modern Australian politics is, I think, is that too many people watch West Wing. And it gives them a false idea of what Australian politics is about and what can be achieved. We do not have a presidential system, and incidentally, another subject, I don't think we should ever have one, because I don't think the presidential system, in my experience of observation of administrations under the two sides of politics in the United States, I don't think the presidential system works any better. In fact, it doesn't work as well in so many areas as does the Australian version of the Westminster system. But the relationship between the leader, the Prime Minister in my experience, and the Cabinet is hugely important, and also slightly wider than that, relationship between the leader and the parliamentary party. If you do not have the people who are relating to you on a daily basis, spruiking your cause with enthusiasm and conviction, you're not going to last. And that is hugely important. And that means, of course, that the people immediately around you have got to be involved in the decision-making process. This idea that command and direction is what leadership is all about is substantially false. It works on occasions. In the political experience I had, there were occasions where my colleagues were perfectly happy because of the exigencies of the issue to call a government position. But generally speaking, Prime Ministers who govern or run their cabinet by telling the members of cabinet via the newspapers on the morning of the cabinet meeting what the decision is going to be, get into a lot of trouble. And it's very important that that not happen. And that applies with, I'm sure, equal force in relation to the administration of a company and in relation to military leadership. So that relationship with those you immediately lead is hugely important. Another thing that I think we have to understand about leadership is that the man or woman who sets out as a leader to never make a mistake is going to be a total failure, because not only does that attitude of mind beget enormous caution, almost to the point of paralysis, but of course it ignores the simple human reality that everybody makes mistakes. The trick of good leadership is to get the big things right. And my prime example of this is always, when I talk about this issue, is always, of course, Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill had a remarkable capacity to get a lot of things wrong. Big time. He made lots of mistakes. Starting from being captured by the Boers and then rescued, incidentally, by a bloke called John Howard, but that's another story, and no relation. However, and then of course we, I think largely as an Australian audience, will understand that he had his share of critics in relation to the Gallipoli campaign. He opposed independence for India. He supported Edward VIII in the abdication crisis. And so there's a very, very long list, but gee, he got the big things right. He stood alone and at the time ridiculed, even reviled as a warmonger when he called out the Nazis and the fascists, and he knew what was happening, and he provided absolutely magnificent leadership to Britain in the darkest days of World War II, and he made a famous speech at Fulton in Missouri in 1946 when he coined the expression the Iron Curtain, when he warned of the menace of the Soviet imperial reach, and indeed if he had been more successful in enticing President Roosevelt away from the embrace of Joseph Stalin, the tragedy of Eastern Europe may have been less, but that's another and a longer story. But my point simply is that you've got to get the big things right. Now, admittedly, Churchill is an egregious example of my proposition, but it is something that's worth bearing in mind. You are going to make mistakes, and if you think that the way you avoid making mistakes is to lapse into caution and timidity, you're going to be a failure. And another thing that I regard as very, very important in leadership is always bear in mind that your instincts can sometimes be more important than the field evidence. You can't do this too often. You'll get into a lot of trouble, but there were occasions in my political career when I decided instinctively to take a stance which was against the weight of all the opinion polling and all the weight of evidence. Now, I think of some of the controversial decisions I took the decision that my government took to join the United States and Britain in the military operation in Iraq in 2003 was probably the most controversial, certainly the most controversial foreign policy decision that my government took, and it was not a popular decision, although it gathered more popularity as time went by and our troops were actually in the field. Now, once again, there's no point in debating at this point the details of whether that was right or wrong, and you will have your views on that. And they're not likely to change as a result of anything that I say. But my point is that it was an illustration of where if you just did the opinion polls and so forth, but you would come to the conclusion that it was a foolish thing to do. On the other hand, I had the feeling all along that partly because of the, well, in no small measure because of the importance of the American alliance to Australia, and given that, although it's now almost completely forgotten, that the prevailing mood after the attack in September 2001 in the United States and around the world was not if but when the next attack on the American homeland would occur. I saw it, and my colleagues overwhelmingly in the Cabinet and the Parliamentary Party saw it as an occasion where Australia should demonstrate support and to embrace the arguments advanced by the United States. Now, that was a question, I suppose, of instinct and gut feeling prevailing over, perhaps certainly opinion polling. If I'd have taken notice of Mark Textor, our opinion pollster, we probably would never have introduced the GST. And it was never on its own uproariously popular. But I believe very strongly that the mark of a successful government was to be seen after the passage of time as having attempted and successfully implemented major economic reforms. And I have no doubt that the judgment in relation to that is vindicated. Now, dragging all of that together, you have a number of things. You have the necessity to stand for something, to have strong, identifiable values. You have the importance, the crucial importance of the relationship between the leader and the immediately led. The supreme importance of getting the big things right and never believing that you can successfully avoid making mistakes. And I suppose it's easier as you get older to accept the reality of that. It's less easy. I look around this room, I can imagine myself at the age of many of the people in this room. I probably thought that I could go through some particular experience with 10 out of 10 on every occasion. Now, of course, as time goes by, you find that that is an absolute pipe dream, and if you set out to do that, you are going to get into awful trouble. You're going to end up being a timid failure. And never underestimate the importance of instinct. Some people call it judgment. Judgment's an important commodity in public life. It's an important commodity in any decision-making responsibility. Choosing between belief and pragmatism. I used to often say to my cabinet colleagues when we were debating the importance of doing something, and some people would say, well, that is going to be incredibly unpopular with the electorate, or with a section of the electorate, and we would search around for a compromise that achieved a fair bit but didn't needlessly antagonise the voters. And I would say to them, well, we've got to find a balance point. It's much better, therefore, to be 80% pure in government than 120% pure in opposition. And sometimes the art of government is to find that balance point between sufficient movement forward to achieve beneficial change and yet not going so far, so zealously that you run the risk of losing the capacity in the future because you're no longer in government to implement that change. Now, it's in areas like this that I think the decision-making responsibility in government is most sharply distinguished from the decision-making quality in business. I've talked to a lot of men and women in business over the years, and one of the things I learnt was that the processes of government don't necessarily equip people effectively to work in the business community, nor does the experience of business equip many men and women from business to be in politics. We in Australia went through this wild idea about 25 years ago that the solution to leadership in Australia was for some prominent businessmen to take a sabbatical of 2 or 3 years, sort out the country, and then go back to the boardrooms. Now, of course, it never quite works like that. But what does work is people in politics understanding how business works and having a constant ear to the importance of the private sector, and equally for people in business to have an understanding of how the political process works. Let me finish on one issue that Michelle raised, one other issue that Michelle raised, and that is for want of a better description, the Paul Kelly thesis that Australia has become virtually ungovernable. It's an interesting theory, and I understand why it's advanced. Can I make the observation that there's probably an element of truth in it, but let us remember that we are not Robinson Crusoe in this experience. What I think has happened around the Western world, particularly amongst those countries that are similar in history and government practice to Australia, the liberal democracies, Britain, the United States, Canada, New Zealand, and a number of countries of Western Europe that we most closely identify with, is that there has been, over the last 25 years, a breakdown of the old binary divide in politics. When I was first engaged in politics, I encountered what I called the 40-40-20 rule. 40% always voted Liberal, 40% always voted Labor, and 20% moved around in the middle. Now I think we're living in a 30-30-40 world. The two major political groupings in this country, Liberal National Party, Labor, no longer command the level of rusted-on support that used to be the case. I think both sides have got what I call a detachable flank of about 15%. In the case of the Labor Party, that detachable flank wanders off to the Greens. And in the case of the coalition, that detachable flank over the last 20 years has wandered off for a period when I was Prime Minister to Pauline Hanson. Most of the people who voted for Hanson, almost 1 million of them in 1998, had voted for the coalition in 1996. And most of the people, not all of them, but most of the people who vote Green, their next preference, and there's plenty of evidence of this, is obviously the Labor Party. The Greens are to the left of the Labor Party. One of the things that's complicating the situation in the Senate at the present time is that it's virtually impossible, it's unthinkable, that the coalition could negotiate any of its economic policies with the Greens, whereas when I was Prime Minister, it was possible on two important occasions for the coalition to negotiate a compromise on two of our major policy issues, Peter Reith's industrial relations reforms of 1996 and the GST. Were able to negotiate them with the Democrats, because the Democrats were far more of they were more genuinely centrist party. They weren't, in a sense, the detachable left-wing flank of the Labor Party. Now, you may disagree with that as a proposition, and I'm sure that plenty of people in this room will, but I think that's one of the realities of what we have. But this breakdown of the binary divide is evident in the United Kingdom. They've got an election in May, and nobody is predicting that either the Labor Party or the Conservative Party can win an absolute majority. Now, maybe they will, but the Labor Party faces the formidable task of not only recovering from last time, but the Scottish Nationalists are ripping seats by the dozen from them, are likely to, in Scotland, which has been a British Labor Party heartland for years, and UKIP is going to take votes from the Conservative Party. So you could end up, I mean, and it looks as though the Liberal Democrats, if the polls are right, are going to be squeezed right out. But nobody is saying that the Conservative Party can, on the polls, can win an absolute majority. I hope they're wrong. I'd like to see them win, obviously. I broadly barrack for the Conservative Party in British elections, why not? But it's just important to bear that in mind, that this is happening all around. It's happening in the United States. The Obama administration has been a lot more left-wing, as I can use that language, than the Clinton administration. Clinton was a real centrist, whereas Obama is not. And part of that is that the character of the Democratic Party has changed, and equally on the Republican side, you've had the rise of the Tea Party, which has produced some, in my opinion, some extraordinarily poor candidates and some strange attitudes. And you have in the American iteration of it is that in becoming the Democratic Party candidate, you've got to be a lot more left-wing than Bill Clinton had to be. And you may well see people trying to, in order to become the Republican candidate, taking a far more right-wing position than perhaps in the end that man or woman might be in government. So the broad coalitions that formed the two great parties in the United States are different now from what they used to be, and this is all part of this experience around the world where I think the binary divide is breaking down, and it manifests itself in different ways, but I think it's an important element. Now, Madam Chairman, that is a rambling dissertation of mine on not only leadership but some thoughts about the contemporary political scene, but I hope it's of some value. Self-evidently, political leadership is different. I certainly can testify, Michelle, that leading the opposition is very hard, as well as leading the government. I'm having had long stints in both jobs. I can testify to the fact that neither of them is easy, and but they were both great experiences, and thank you very much for asking me, and I'll be very happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Well, before I throw this to the floor, maybe I can start with one question. In recent years, we've seen two Prime Ministers replaced by their own side. We've seen another Prime Minister's leadership obviously under a lot of pressure and question. I just wonder how, when a leader is under this sort of pressure, he or she meets that situation. What mechanisms do they have for coping? You were not as Prime Minister in that sort of dire situation, but nevertheless faced some pressures in the first term, and one response was the big idea, the bold move, the GST. But a leader in that situation, what should he or she do?
Well, I think he or she should apply the checklist that I've given. Firstly, is the public and the party sufficiently clear as to what you stand for, what you believe in? If the public is confused about the direction in which you wish to take the country or your party, then you've got a big problem. Is your relationship with the people you immediately lead in good order? I mean, I don't want to sound in any way partisan, but it was self-evident that Kevin Rudd's relationship with his cabinet had broken down very badly. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been removed. I mean, he defeated me in an election in 2007, and I thought his party would probably retain office for a couple of terms. And I was surprised at the rapid internal deterioration. Now, he obviously didn't pay enough regard to that second limb. Thirdly, have you got the big things right? I'm a great believer in the idea that you can persuade the public in this country of the need for reform, provided you can persuade the people that it's in the public interest, in Australia's interest, and providing they believe it's fair. If I can draw on a person I admire enormously, won't surprise you, the first female Prime Minister of Great Britain, Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher's final, the reason in the end I think she lost the support of her party was her determination to go ahead with the poll tax to replace the rating system, and I think that fell down on the score of fairness. It might have been a good idea in theory, but the average person found it hard to accept that the amount being paid for a facility by a humble employee of a local council should be the same as that paid by the Duke of Westminster. It just seemed fundamentally unfair, although she had plenty of arguments and so forth. But I think you can. People will go for something if you can satisfy them that it's in the public interest and that it's fair. So I think if you apply those sort of theories, now in the end, politics is inexorably driven by the laws of arithmetic, and if it's self-evident that a change of leadership is going to dramatically improve a party's polling position, they will do it. I thought Bob Hawke was the most successful leader the Labor Party has had in my lifetime by a long way, and but in the end the Labor Party decided to replace him with Paul Keating because they thought they might have a better chance of winning. And when I returned to the leadership, it was not because, in 1995, it was not because people felt it was my turn or I deserved a fair go or they essentially liked me. They just concluded that I might have a better chance of winning the election than did any alternative then available in the Liberal Party. Now that's always a consideration, a big driver of behaviour. But to answer your question, Michelle, if you are under pressure, applying those sort of considerations will help enormously.
Now, can I invite some questions? Over here.
Thank you, John. That was really interesting. Almost following on from Michelle's question, I suppose, but to what extent do you know, you talked about having conviction in the way in which you set about leading, but how do you know you're right? And at what point do you decide you were wrong with a particular leadership direction and change it?
Well, knowing and believing that you are right is a matter of personal conviction, I suppose, the chicken and the egg. And you determine right or wrong according to your own scale of values and moral principles. That's what I regard as if you don't have a personal moral compass, it's pretty hard to have a consistent attitude as to what is right and what is wrong. How do you know whether? Well, one way of knowing that you're wrong politically is that you get voted out of office, perhaps. That doesn't mean to say you're wrong. I mean, you can get voted out of office, and the tide of history will tell you that that was a mistake, but that's just part of the democratic process. But in the end, what you're advocating is right if it sits comfortably with your own personal moral code and as you interpret the fundamental values of the Liberal Party. We had a position on industrial relations, which involved, and as a result of that, we had three big areas of reform. We had the changes made by Peter Reith in 1996, who brought in workplace contracts. We had the huge upheaval of changing the culture of the Australian waterfront, which was incredibly difficult and controversial. And then we had work choices. I thought all of those pieces of legislation were, and all of those approaches were absolutely correct. Clearly, we made an error in getting rid of the no disadvantage test in work choices, but I don't think in the end that was the reason we lost the election. There are other reasons as well, but the point is that in public life you do what you think is right according to your own moral framework and also the philosophy and values of the party you lead. If you start doing things in government that are clearly contrary to the fundamental philosophy of your own party, you'll get into enormous trouble.
Sorry. Over here? Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Howard. I had a question, particularly in relation to your mention of the constitutional monarchy and the republic. When do you know when it's wise to not do something as a leader?
When it's wise not to do something.
Not to do something. How do you decide that kind of thing?
How do you put that in the... What's the reason for you contextualising that to the debate on the monarchy and the republic?
Yes, so the constitutional monarchy, you seem to be pointing towards the fact that it's a system that works quite well for us. The Australian version of liberal democracy in the Westminster system works quite well for us. Yet many people, of course, are quite engaged in the campaign for an Australian republic. How do you know when's the right time to hold your ground on those kind of things?
Well, if you ask me in relation to that, whenever a change is put forward, and in this particular case I actually facilitated the change being put forward, even though I didn't believe in the change, and in an appropriate way argued against the change. I suppose if you apply an ordinary conservative principle that you don't change something unless you are satisfied that the change is going to produce a better outcome than you have at the present time. And I think that's an important principle, and that's really the attitude I applied and I continue to apply. And the question of whether we remain a monarchy or become a republic is always in the hands of the Australian people. We're a democracy before we're a monarchy or a republic, and therefore it's up to the Australian people to make that decision. At the present time, I don't find any great push for it. That's not to say it won't return. People say to me, do you think we'll ever become a republic? I said, well, anything's possible, and if you want to know my position in 5 years' time, come back and, what my view is. My position is very unlikely to change, but what my view about what will happen, come back and ask me in 5 years' time. But I think when you know whether or not to stand your ground, I think it depends a little bit on the intensity of the issue. When you're dealing with something as fundamental as whether you have a monarchy or a republic, it's not a tactical thing, it's a belief thing. But there are a lot of issues in politics where, from a tactical point of view, it's pointless arguing with something, even though you may not like it. But on other occasions, it is a question of how strongly you take a stand at any given time.
I know Virginia is going to be a tough timekeeper, but maybe we can just squeeze in a couple of quick questions, because we have a unique opportunity here for questions. Who else is?
The lady.
Thank you very much, Mr. Howard. My question's about self-awareness. And as a leader, I wonder how you maximise your strengths and in some way compensate for your weaknesses.
Well, you think about it. You listen to your wife and family, and you listen to people around you. It's very important to have advisors who are willing to tell you when you've made mistakes. Very, very important. I was blessed with an extremely good staff. My senior advisors were very good. You've got to have a capacity to draw on the advice that's available. The Prime Minister has an extraordinary bounty of advice, a very high quality, in the public service, in your own staff, and you've got to maintain a circle of friends who will tell you when, and family, and having loyal friends who are frank and are prepared to tell you what are your weaknesses is very, very important, because self-awareness, you can get carried away. And a simple example is the atmosphere of question times. I used to enjoy occasionally getting worked up in question time and attacking the other side, and your own crowd would be cheering you on and everything, and you'd think, gee, that was a great question time, and I'd go back home and they said, Dad, that was overdone. That was terrible. We don't want you performing, we want you... And it's true, the public are interested in what you're doing for them, not your constant enjoyment of the theatre of the place. And I think it's very, very important that to bear, and that's a very significant point of self-awareness, that the best time, and this is true since Parliament was televised, it was different before, and I think it's a very important lesson in self-awareness.
There's one over here, and then perhaps here.
Thank you, Mr. Howard. I just have one question that has two sides to it. If you would do one thing differently in the past, what would it be? And then if you, as a leader, and then in 50 years from now, what would you think your one real legacy would be?
Well, I frankly, the second question, that's so speculative, it's impossible to answer. I just don't know. I might go close if the field evidence, and I haven't always followed that, of course, but if the field evidence continues to hold, I might say gun control reform. I think all the evidence is that Australia is a safer place as a result of those gun laws. I think that's tremendously important. If I could reverse one particular decision, there's plenty, but a major decision, I think we should not have taken the no disadvantage test out of work choices. I don't think that would have made any difference to the result of the 2007 election. I thought the other policies we took were broadly correct. I wouldn't have changed our position on Afghanistan or Iraq. I know that's not fashionable in some circles, but I wouldn't. And I wouldn't have, certainly wouldn't have had a different view on GST and the general reforms. And also this idea that in 2006 and 2007 we shouldn't have given the extra surplus back in tax cuts is ludicrous. It was the public's money. And after you provided a decent surplus and after you invested in all the things the country needed, you ought to give it back to the people who contributed it in the first place. I see some economists now saying you should have piled up even greater surpluses. That would have been unsustainable in the politics of 2006 and 2007.
Final question here.
Good morning, Mr. Howard, and thanks for your address this morning. I appreciated it very much. My name's Dennis Tan, Royal Australian Air Force. You were talking about the need for conviction and belief and to be okay with your mistakes. And in my mind, that's really underpinned by that key attribute of resilience that you talked about. I'm wondering if you have any advice on how we can build resilience in our people, particularly in a society where everyone believes they're a little bit special.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think to start with, taking up your last point, we should encourage people to believe that everybody is special. In a way, that is the foundation of my belief about this country, that every person is important, and encouraging self-belief. If I have a generic criticism on occasions of Australian societies, we sometimes lack cultural self-belief. This has been a remarkably successful country. And one of the really clever things that this country has done is to take the good bits of its heritage and not the less so good bits of its heritage. And we owe a lot to the British, the rule of law, parliamentary democracy, free press, a generally civil society, and a reasonably flexible sense of humour. But there are some things that and we've got most of that, but we haven't chosen their class structure, and some of those sort of the social stratification, which, you know, heaven forbid, didn't do that. So we've been actually very good, and we've absorbed people from all around the world, and that's been a good thing, providing we, don't lapse into the mistake of trying to build a situation where you have to bargain with different sets of the community as to how you run the country. I mean, I say you bring people from everywhere, but they become part of the mainstream. We have, over the last number of years, we have begun to engage far more sensibly in understanding the proper place of the first Australians in our community. There'll be continued debate about that, but that was something that was ignored for a very, very long period of time. And how it finally works out will be an endless source of debate. But I think that my starting point always about this country is that it's been hugely successful. And I talk about the Australian achievement, and the Australian achievement has been good in the way in which we see our relationship with our region as so important, both economically and politically, is something that many Australians 50 years ago would not have contemplated. But I'm an optimist. But the source of my optimism is that Australians are still at heart quite resilient, individualistic people, and encouraging people to believe that each man and woman is special is the reason, in my view, for that resilience, that we should focus far more on the individual than on the collective.
Well, we don't often get the opportunity to get reflections from the inside on political leadership, and I think it's been a fascinating session this morning. On behalf of everyone, John Howard, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I too would like to add to that. I feel we've been in a very privileged position here this morning to hear these reflections. And indeed, the Honourable John Howard has set us a wonderful foundation for the discussion over today and tomorrow, highlighting those issues of leadership, particularly resilience and relationships, belief, trusting your own instinct, and most importantly, that moral compass, which is something we will talk more and more about. Ladies and gentlemen, it has been a wonderful honour to have Mr. Howard with us today, and indeed also with Michelle Grattan, my colleague from the University of Canberra. Would you please give them a big, warm Canberra thank you? We are now going to take a short break before our next session, which is all about you. We want to hear about future leaders and what we want from you. We'll take a short break and convene back in here just before 10:30. Thank you very much. And once again, thank you to John Howard and Michelle Grattan.